all over the country, we're getting these huge gatherings of people. They're young, they're old, they're black, they're white, all ages, many outlooks, many people who've never been involved in politics before.
Another world is possible if we come together.
You're Nazi apologists. You're Nazi apologists. Rewriting history. Rewriting history.
The emails that were linked demonstrated that people right at the top of the Labour Party and the senior officials in headquarters were actively working against Labour.
Jeremy Corbyn is not a Labour MP because he's called Jeremy Corbyn, or because he's fantastic, or because he makes jam. He's the Labour MP because local Labour Party members selected him as the best candidate to stand for Labour in that constituency. And that should be normal practice at every opportunity after every election.
Many British Jews once saw the Labour Party as their natural political home. No longer.
But as much as he tried to broaden the agenda, it was his Brexit declaration last night on Question Time which was still fueling debate.
But the question is, will you campaign to remain or leave the EU if elected?
I mean, this is the defining issue of our times, and the Labour leader says he doesn't know which side he's going to back.
I voted Labour all my life. First time, I voted Tory this time.
Hello to everybody out there, and it's Monday evening, 7 o'clock, and it's welcome to Red Line TV. And the big one tonight, the big question we're asking is, Corbyn, what went wrong? Now, before we get into what is going to be, I think, a really interesting programme, just a couple of things. One is, as you know, we had a bit of a break last week so that we could think about how things are going. And we have decided at the moment for a while to just be on once every 2 weeks. But I assure you, we are doing that so that the quality can just keep climbing, because the feedback we've had has been just stupendous. I mean, watching that video tonight, and I can see somebody has said in the chat, makes them want to cry. And you just go through those highs and lows. I remember on the first day when Corbyn was elected, being in the pub after the election, and my partner Graham Bash saying to me, just watch this now, see what's happening, because this is the best it's going to be. So tonight we're going to have a look at that. We're going to have a look at the good, we're going to have a look at the bad, and we're going to start tonight with a video from Dr. Toyin Agbetu, who unfortunately can't be with us today. If you remember, he's a lecturer in anthropology, and he has his own views on the Corbyn era. Briefly, when you heard that Corbyn was going to try and be the leader of the Labour Party, and when he first got in, what was your kind of initial response to this?
It still brings a smile to my face, actually. I think the key word is that I was hopeful. There was a sense of things could get better. I know it sounds really cliched, and that's been aligned to the Blair era, but there really was that sense that that for the first time, there was this possibility of a genuine, ethical, inclusive, social justice orientated UK, that would happen in my lifetime and leave a legacy for my children and my community. And, perhaps I've been a bit over romantic.
As things went on, did your opinion change at all? Did you find that there were things that troubled you, or were there other things that made you feel great, this is fantastic?
I wasn't troubled by Corbyn, because he's been quite consistent. It was the first time that I was actually willing to come out and openly support a Labour leader. And as a Pan-Africanist, that's a very problematic position to take, because you're kind of aware, very much so, that often when we talk about right or left-wing parties, they're actually Tweedledee and Tweedledum, playing the same capitalist game. So Corbyn was quite consistent. I didn't have a problem with him, but I did have a huge problem with the political party itself. It kind of went through the civil war, where you had those who had signed up to the original Labour values of socialism, of inclusivity, who kind of like being an ethical party for change, were then being pushed back by these careerists, these politicians who'd got so used to being in Parliament, they'd lost connection with the real grassroots struggles. And they started literally joining with right-wing commentators to attack the Corbyn project. And that was a shock that that's something I should have anticipated. Perhaps I was caught along with the romanticism at the time, but it was hurtful. It wounded me deeply, and it put me back in a position where I just didn't want to engage in mainstream politics again.
Do you think that a phenomenon, which was the Corbyn movement, has left the left in a better or a worse position?
That's a tricky one. I don't think it's a yes or no answer. Where we are now is clearly a worse situation. That the Labour Party is no longer fit for purpose. But one of the great things about the Corbyn era, if we want to call it that, was the fact that he kind of re-engaged young people with politics. In fact, in many ways, it was that engagement which is what started to go wrong. Not because momentum itself, as an example, was not a fantastic phenomenon, but I think what happened was there was a failure to actually get involved in organising more. So rather than campaigning and rallying, there was just a massive groundswell of people like myself who would normally not be engaged in mainstream politics, starting to re-engage. And what happened, everything was so focused on getting Labour Party elected that they missed an amazing opportunity to actually start doing like grassroots work. And I say this because during the pandemic, we saw those same people, those same ethically minded individuals actually starting doing, kind of like food banks, kind of like taking care of elders who couldn't go shopping. We saw that. And I think that's what the movement that Corbyn galvanized should have been doing. Rather than planning only to get into government, they should have actually been actively doing work so that those people who were pushing against them couldn't actually push against the actual tangible deeds of the campaign that took place with young people. There were many other things. I mean, I don't think that the Labour Party's issue with anti-racism, for example, is in a good place. I think that the weaponising of Corbynism's humanitarianism has been completely exploited, has completely decimated any chance of a decent ethical discussion on issues like anti-Semitism or racism. In fact, what happened by conflating anti-Semitism with anti-colonialism and anti-racism and anti-Zionism, people are frightened to talk about race again. And as we move towards Stephen Lawrence Day, when people had to recognize that actually we need to engage with these issues, because like what happened with Child Q, race is still such a toxic issue in our society. It's not just about capitalism. Capitalism exploits race. It didn't invent it. Racism existed before capitalism. I think that that's part of the legacy. That's why I say it's not a good or bad thing. The Labour Party right now is prostrate and not fit for purpose, but we now know that we exist. We now know that even though we didn't win this battle, there's millions of us who actually still have that dream and still have that vision. And that for me is an amazing thing to hold on to.
And there you go, quite an optimistic view there. Well, we'll see as the discussion goes on which way we're feeling about it. Tina.
Yes, hi. We want to start tonight with a discussion with both Graham Bush and a surprise guest who is a former MP, Alan Simpson, who's joining us. If I can find him.
Hello then.
There you go.
Can you hear me?
Hello. Yes. Hi. Hi to you
Okay.
both. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for
Hello,
being
Graham.
Hello. Guest. Hi. So that was quite a moving interview, I thought, with Toyin. Sort of the hope, isn't it? To get the hope up, and then it was crushed, and it's been crushed over a period of years, really. Alan, you're a former MP, left MP. You were a leading member of the campaign group, socialist campaign group. You set up Labour Against the War, etc., and you helped out in Jeremy Corbyn's office, I understand, during his leadership.
Well,
how did you experience the sort of, things going wrong? When did you start seeing things unraveling?
I think we need to draw a distinction between Jeremy the person and Jeremy the circumstances. I mean, it was a remarkable moment in time that reclaimed the sense of solidarity and a real belief in transformative possibilities. And Jeremy lifted the lid on that, and we saw the response up and down the country. So that was brilliant. I've been Jeremy's mate for more years than we count. I lived with him twice, not in a biblical sense, but I shared an office with him for 15 years in Parliament and had breakfast with him every Tuesday morning during his leadership of the party. And it seems to me that there were two phases. The first was when first elected, forget the right-wing press, it was the right-wing Parliamentary Labour Party and party machine that pursued him relentlessly. And we often, I think, don't give him enough credit for just having survived that period. I mean, it really was relentless. The attacks on him were coming in pretty much every half hour. And that was, we didn't control the party machine. Democrats, let alone left Democrats, didn't control the party machine, so that we weren't able to do what I think was needed. And that's to say, okay, let's go in for mandatory reselection for us all. And the left stepping forward and saying, I'll go first. We ought to have been there, and it would have been a huge shock to the system inside the PLP if we'd been able to do that. But Jeremy struggled to, he wouldn't have got it through the National Executive Committee, and you had a party general secretary who spent most of his time, as well as the staff time, making sure that every step forward Jeremy took, there were two or three people that wanting to pull the rug from under him. That was the first stage. After the Theresa May election debacle, it all changed. And my message to Jeremy from that point on was that initially he wasn't likely to be destroyed by his enemies. As things unfolded, he was really more likely to have been destroyed by his friends. And I say that with sadness, because you could see in his office a sense in which sectarian left politics overrode genuine left politics. And Jeremy is immensely loyal. He is not vindictive. And I think he paid the price for that. For me, all of the really big transformative ideas that came out of John's office and Jeremy were held back, partly on the climate ones, because Seamus Milne, I think, never got climate. And I just don't think Seamus went out in the way that Jeremy did. I don't think Seamus has ever knowingly canvassed in his life. So that sense of radical decentralisation just didn't engage. And I think Carrie Murphy and others around her were obsessed with the centralising of control inside Jeremy's office. And that separated him an awful lot from the movement. People still thought that Jeremy was there in spirit and in his heart and in practice. He was doing meetings everywhere, but the stuff was no longer coming through from his office in ways that empowered people in the movement in all sorts of places around the country. And for me, I was there doing the sort of climate advisory policies, and they just weren't understood. And I think we missed that hugely important central space that would have allowed Jeremy to say, look, this what is unfolding isn't going to wait for a political consensus. Physics is in the driving seat, and democracy and sustainability are going to be what brings us through it and unites the country behind it. And he never had the space to do that.
That's a very interesting take on things. To be honest, I'm not sure I've quite looked at it that way. From you've been inside, obviously, being on the outside, with Labour against the witch hunt, etc. I'd seen other forces who I would have thought are more to blame for the downfall. Graham, I mean, in terms of the right wing inside the Labour Party that Alan described in that first phase, do you think the Corbyn leadership did enough to take them on actively?
The short answer, Tina, is no. Firstly, lovely to see you, Alan. And I think I think we start from the same place. But let's look at the context. It was never going to be easy. We were always going to be fighting against the odds because the establishment was in control of the party machinery, and Jeremy having to fight with that baying mob in the Parliamentary Labour Party behind him. And my first statement, I think, is to say that took courage and resilience, whatever the mistakes which were made. And at times, I just don't know how he did it with that mob behind him. But mistakes were made, and they add up to one thing. Above all, I think, it was an illusion that our movement could ever take on the establishment forces outside, the Tories, the state, the media, without building a mass movement to take on the establishment forces inside our party. And one of my jobs here today is to say what briefing the magazine's position was and what its host organisation, the Labour Representation Committee, was. And I'd just like to quote from the last LRC AGM just a few months ago, which said this: a precondition for challenging the establishment forces from outside would have been to take on the forces of the establishment within our party. So, for example, it was inconceivable that the parliamentary party, unless fundamentally transformed, could ever have been an ally for transformation. And so it proved. This meant, one, removing the key sections of the party bureaucracy, the general secretary, the regional officers; two, a movement from below against the entrenched power of the PLP, which I think was Corbyn's most dangerous enemy, the most reactionary force in British politics. And that could be only done, as you say, through mandatory reselection, open selection. And it meant also supporting party members against the witch hunt. But the key contradiction for Jeremy was the contradiction between the most left-wing leadership in Labour's history, and that's what he was, and the weakness, indeed decline, of the organisations of the working class since the defeat of the miners' strike in the 80s, the low-ebb class struggle. Because what was needed against the establishment was a movement from below. If we're talking about socialism, we're talking about a mass movement from below. But the party membership reached a historic high, but the movement was weak, and this did limit Jeremy's options. So, I think that he faced a problem, but when it really comes down to the crunch, we could only build a movement from below. And at key times, I think the leadership didn't stand with those members who were witch hunted, who wanted open selection. And it was an illusion that we could somehow get socialism through stealth, somehow forcing the right wing of the Parliamentary Labour Party, that we could get things through. We had to confront them, however difficult, however weak the movement, because we were at least at the level of leadership in control of the party, and we had built a membership which was loyal to us, and we should and could have used it. It's so easy to say these things in retrospect, however, let me say that.
We did say it at the time as well.
We said it at the time, of course, on the witch hunt. But some of the statements that we put in briefing and in the LRC around that time were very good, but they became better as time went on, as we could see things more clearly.
And I was going to pick you up on something you just said in terms of, the relationship between the Labour Party and socialism is I think, quite an interesting one to explore. You said, there was no real effort made to build a movement, something that Toyin mentioned as well at the beginning, which is, of course, in our view, the key to building socialism is empowering those below. I mean, there was no, attempt for proper education on A level, no media outlets, etc. How do you see, though, the relationship? What could have happened? Some people actually seem to think that Jeremy Corbyn, because he's a socialist, could have kind of, delivered socialism of some sort had he been elected as prime minister. Alan, what's your view in terms of the relationship between a Labour government and the fight for socialism?
Again, it seems to me that's I see that in terms of those two separate phases in Jeremy's leadership term. Jeremy was fighting to survive in that first part, and I think Graham's right to say, we ought to pay tribute to the sort of heroics of. I said to him at one point when the flag. I mean, there were queues of people outside the leader's office just wanting to get in to abuse him. And I said in one of the quiet moments where people weren't abusing him, look, mate, and if you ever feel that you've done your stint, I don't think anyone would fault you for saying, I've tried, but I'm not going to get any further. And he said, no, I don't have the right to do that. I was elected by the movement, and if I'm to be removed, it will be that I'll be removed by the movement. Until then, I stand by my guns and the promises I made. So, there is something really dignified about Jeremy the person and the principles. But we weren't strong enough in the left, inside the parliamentary party or inside the party, to be able to take on the machine that Blair left behind, much of which is horrendous. I mean, it's not just horrendously right wing, it is deeply individualistic, careerist, and vicious. And those were the forces that Jeremy was fighting off. And so the fact that he survived to get past that point was great. I think we made errors tactically in failing to deal with the anti-Semitism issue by taking a lead on it early on. And I think we made terrible holics about the Brexit stuff. And Jeremy was caught by contradictions in his own office and not wanting to upset some of his closest friends there by opening up those divisions. I didn't think there was a way that we could have tackled that without being honest about the bigger crisis and building a movement that was based around sustainability and inclusivity. And actually, it was great when Jeremy was at his best when he and John, and maybe he and John and Diane were together. But it was really interesting to see how those closest to him politically were also sidelined. It didn't surprise me that I was left out of the loop of lots of meetings, or that Diane was left out. But when it reached the point where John was being left out of the circulation of notices of meetings, I just thought there's an internal machine here that is definitely not working on the agenda, the common agenda that John and Jeremy and the rest of the broad left were shared and it had invested huge amounts of hope and principled commitment to. So, that's the difficulty. Historically, this is also what Jeremy's weakness. His lads said to us at the start, to John Mack in particular, just make sure that you're there for every major appointment, because our dad's brilliant, but he's had lots of people he's employed who've ended up taking him for a ride, and that's what happened. And I think the good appointments were ones that John also had a say in, and the bad ones were ones where he was excluded from the process.
I think when you said we should have dealt with anti-Semitism from the beginning, I mean, our view would be that taking on the false allegations of anti-Semitism should have happened right at the start, and saying, you know,
absolutely, and that's what we were saying at the time. But it was always, in a sense, being dealt with at an arm's length and a one remove basis. Well, and outside, we weren't tackling it.
Yeah, wrong allegations often for political reasons, but we're going to get to that in that case. So Graham, briefly, if you may, the relationship. I do think it's quite an interesting subject. The relationship between a Labour government, what can it do to actually, you know, get us closer to socialism? Because, you know, you can't have an act of parliament to say, you know, oh, now we have socialism. Thank you very much. It's the act of the majority of the working class, isn't it?
Well, it made me smile, Tina, when you asked, can a Labour government deliver socialism? Because I think it's a bit of a simplistic question. So let me answer it in two ways. One with a simplistic answer, which is no. But secondly, with a much more complex answer. Because if we're talking about socialism, we mean struggling for power against the establishment, struggling against the power of the state, the media, and all of the forces of the establishment. And that's basically the extra parliamentary power of the establishment. And the only way we can fight that extra parliamentary power is with our own extra parliamentary power of the mass movement. Now, in a period of decline, that isn't easy, but it needs to be done. So that is the motor force for change. But does that mean the Labour Party and Labour governments are irrelevant? Exactly the contrary, because I think the role of socialist leadership, and this is quite a complex point, is to be strong enough to be able to support the movement from below, to sanction the movement from below, to legitimise it, to give it legal sanction. And that is the job of a socialist leadership, to support the movement. And although in the trade unions the movement was weak, in the party, the left in many ways has never been stronger. It wasn't properly organised. I've got real doubts about the role of momentum, to be honest, right from the outset. But it was there to be organised, and it meant supporting the members at all times. Now, Jeremy did very well in many ways on that, but I would say the whole leadership let us down on open selection, and it let us down on the witch hunt. And the way that many comrades, some of us here tonight, were actually allowed to go down on the basis, well, we'll draw the line there and then the issue will be over. I remember one comrade telling me when Ken Livingstone, one of the best anti-racist representatives our movement has ever produced, when he resigned, they said, oh, good, that'll draw the line under it. And then, of course, the next day, Margaret Hodge was on the attack again. I mean, it was foolish, to be honest. So, but look, can a Labour government deliver socialism? In a nutshell, we need the movement from below, sanctioned by the leadership of the Labour Party. And that is what we came near to beginning to achieve. And I'm afraid that at key times, it didn't happen.
And I think we need to, next time we ever get close to a situation like that, we really need to understand that we have to take on the right and not to try and appease them, because they shan't be appeased. They won't. They will do anything in their power to stop the left from getting any kind of little hold into the structures of power, of course. And
Tina, can I just add on that? Sure. I think we need to ask now, what are the fragments that we need to pick up, and how do we pick them up? And I mean, I'm just climate obsessed, and that was why I left, and that's what I worked on with Jeremy and John. But things are now going to break down at a colossal rate, and within this year, we're going to see food shortages as well as the energy price hikes. And this is not going to get any easier. And the answer to this, I mean, there are some fantastic initiatives all around Europe and around North and South America and parts of the South that are beginning from the radical relocalization of the politics of security, inclusion, and sustainability. Now, I think as internationalists, we have to do what Jeremy would have been doing, and that is reaching out and pulling those strands together in order to empower the conversations that the left have to lead at every locality level around the country, because Parliament is just intellectually out to lunch at the moment. And that doesn't mean that there isn't a disinterest in politics. The formal party politics, as seen in Parliament, is just seen as having lost contact with reality. But climate realities are going to force us into whole new spaces. And that is the space that I think Jeremy would want us to reach out and connect with and throw up new leadership to come up with the answers that I still believe he would have reached if he'd been in there.
The question of barbarism or socialism is certainly approached
absolutely,
very rapidly at the moment.
Rosa Luxemburg still resonates.
Thank you both for joining us. That was a very good start to our show. Thank you. We're now going to take a look at the role of the media, and Jackie is...
Yeah, and we actually went on the road to see what people thought, people who had been supporters, people who hadn't. What did they think about what was the media onslaught?
Jeremy Corbyn, what went wrong?
What went wrong? I believe it stemmed from mainstream media and how Murdoch didn't really want a leftist or a socialist government.
He had the establishment against him, he had the mainstream media against him, but he had his own party against him.
I think one of the main things wrong was that the Parliamentary Labour Party didn't want him. They don't like socialists in the Labour Party.
A lot of people like me joined the Labour Party because they saw a socialist leading the party at last. What they didn't realise that a load of the people still in the party hated socialism.
I just think the establishment weren't going to let it happen. It was a chance for us to have a fairer, more just society. But there were people who were going to lose money because of that. And so they obliterated him, they annihilated him.
Yeah, that's quite something. And that now leads into our next conversation. And have we got Greg Philo there? Greg Philo is the director of the Glasgow University Media Project, which was actually established in the 70s and has an amazing record of looking at the media, researching the media, and telling us what effect that the media has on us, the people, and how we feel and how we respond. Now, one thing I'd like to ask you, given your historical aspect that you may have, this kind of misreporting of the Labour Party has happened for quite some time. What was there that was different between what happened before with Labour Party leaders and then what happened with Corbyn?
Correctly noted, extremely old, and my work does go right back to 75 was our first book. So I met up with Tony Benn in 80, and we then talked through the issues that were happening then. And in some ways, the assault was very similar on Ben, and the attack on the left as being irrational, impossible. You can see very direct parallels between the way in which Ben was attacked and the way in which socialist alternatives were presented as being irrational, impossible, sort of fairy tales, fairyland, you know, a sort of, and by a leader who was simply complete, you know, by a potential leader who was simply completely out of touch. And that same approach was used in some ways with Corbyn. And when you look, you know, after the last election, when the media were doing vox pops in the street, you know, they said, well, what did you think about Labour? People were actually saying, well, it all sounded very nice, but it was a fairy tale. You know, it was irrational. It was impossible. It was just a dream that they were offering. So that sense of the power of the media to create that vision, but also I think of the inability of the Labour Party in the last election to overturn that or to attack it, I think is the important thing. The question is, why did it go so wrong last time? I mean, Ben was actually pretty good at taking on the media. I mean, he lost in the party just to Healy, but he was actually very good at demolishing the media. It was Ben that made us famous, because Ben would attack the framework of the media all the time. He never let them ask a straight question without questioning himself where that attack had come from, where that view had come from. So if he was on Newsnight and they asked him a question about, you know, himself or his policies or whatever, he would say, that's the sort of question that you would ask because you're the BBC. Yeah. That's the sort of question. See, Ben was media trained. He was ex-media professional himself. So he really ruffled them. And he would say, that's the kind of question that the Glasgow Media Group have analysed in their research. And he said it again and again and again, to the point that the journalists heard our name so often from Ben that they started to come up to see us. They had to, because people were saying, well, what is this funny group that Ben keeps talking about, you know? And he was able to change the agenda by pushing alternatives into the media.
What should Corbyn have done? When this all started, what should Corbyn have done? How should he have responded?
You need a media strategy, which they didn't have. And it was absolutely crucial. And people were screaming at Corbyn and MacDonald, myself, Ken Loach, lots of people, to say, look, you must have a proper media strategy. And I did, you know, speak, you know, many times with them to talk about issues like rebuttal units, about media training, about the sorts of things that Ben was able to do so easily that were so elusive, you know, for Corbyn and MacDonald. And what I think is that there was a sense in which there had to be a firm, total rejection of the media message. It was as if the response of the Labour Party was constantly defensive, apologetic, apologising, actually, you know, and instead of saying, this, you know, if a criticism is correct, you have to say, look, that bit's right. But this, and this is wrong, this is false. And the reason you're saying these false things is because your organisation does not want a socialist alternative, you know, and you attack. And that sense of the need to attack, there was, you know, I think just so much turning the other cheek and not enough driving the thieves out of the temple. You know, I think that was what was required. And things like a rebuttal unit, having proper communications agency working for you, having a proper staffing of media contacts, you know, hiring people to contact every part of the media, having a whole media team on hand all the time, day and night, to constantly feed back the alternative and to attack what is said. And also the key issue, I think, was media training, because it's such an opportunity to, if you become leader of the opposition, you have an automatic access to the BBC. Now you're going to be attacked. You have an automatic access to the media. You're going to be attacked and trashed. But I spoke to an ex-communications director of the Labour Party, and he said to me, it can't be a surprise that the Labour Party is attacked when it if it has a left-wing leader. You can't react as if, oh my goodness, you know, the media are being horrible, we're not going to go on the media. You've got to have a strategy. So that when you are asked, you know, a difficult question, you immediately attack the framework. You immediately think of time after time when Jeremy would go in and he'd be asked a question like, you know, what do you think of shoot to kill? And of course, a question like that is barbed. It's meant to trip you up. The hidden agenda within it, or the agenda within it, is the Labour Party is soft on terrorists. The Labour Party will not defend the people of Britain. The Labour Party doesn't, is more concerned with rights of terrorists than defending people. So it's a simple piece of media training to spot that and to make your first statement take out the ideology. So your first statement in a situation like that has to be, the first priority of the Labour Party is to defend the people of Britain, to keep the safety, security of the people of Britain. It's absolutely crucial that we will keep our streets safe. And then you say, the question is, how do we do that? If you have a police with automatic weapons, you obviously don't want them shooting the wrong person, do you? So you've got to have evidence. You've got to be very careful, and then you can, at that point, you can bring in, the sort of very tragic story of Jean Menendez.
Can I just ask, just finally?
Yeah.
I wasn't clear what you said. Really, did you get in touch with them? Did they get in touch with you? Was there any contact between you and the leadership? Because it strikes me.
Yeah,
there should have been. So can you just give us very briefly, why that didn't work?
Well, I think what happened was that there was a sense that it had to be done, that something had to be done. People like Ken Loach were pushing and pushing and pushing with John McDonnell, and we were asked to give advice. So we did, and I think for the 2017 election, some of that advice was taken, and they did have a communications agency and made, and some of it was better. But after that, they did, I think what happened, my judgment was that they did quite well in that election and thought that all they needed was more grassroots activity. But of course, that's fatal, because you give up the capacity that you have to dominate the center of the stage. And it doesn't matter that the media are attacking you. It's better. The more controversy, the more people will come to you. That's what Trump knew. It didn't matter that the media were attacking Trump. The media ran after Trump everywhere because they wanted to know the next thing he was going to say. So the point is, you use that space. You use it to push and push and push your agenda, and you attack the people who are distorting your messages. You don't let them get away with it. You say, you've only asked that question because your organization does not want a wealth tax. They do not want the discussion of inequality and poverty that we are raising. And you expose that. And then when your activists go out into the street, then when they knock on the door and people say, oh yeah, I saw on the telly, yeah, oh yeah, that's about, But what was happening in the last election was that you couldn't get people to pick up the phone, or if you did, they would go, oh no, it was just, if it's not on the telly, it somehow doesn't count. So you've got to get it on the television and onto the media. And that space is vital to occupy. And it is totally irrelevant that they're attacking you. It's better if they attack you. But that was never really understood. And I think Jeremy just found it difficult, and he was just
it's almost as if it went against his character to do that. Can I just bring in on this now Simon Maggin, whose hashtag "it was a scam" has become really well known on Twitter, not just for its persistence in terms of the campaign to actually reveal what the anti-Semitism scam was about, but the accuracy it has at revealing the lack of evidence behind a lot which has just been taken for granted by the media. Simon, to just come to you for a minute, when did you, as an individual, notice what was happening?
I noticed quite early on with Naz Shah and with Ken Livingstone. It was obvious to me right from the outset what was happening, which was that there was an attempt to create this narrative about anti-Semitism around the left of the Labour Party. It seemed perfectly obvious to me that that was what was happening. And it was rumbling on all through 16 and 17, and then really picked up speed in 18 and 19. But it's been continuous. And there were reports before Corbyn of people sort of worrying about anti-Semitism prior to Corbyn, when, for instance, Miliband, who of course was Jewish, was leader. And I remember a lot of chatter around people saying they could not vote for Miliband because he was supporting the Palestinian or wanting to recognize the Palestinian state. It goes right back, but it was perfectly obvious to me that was what was happening. I couldn't understand how it was not obvious to everybody that was what was happening, because the accusations were just patently ridiculous and were completely unchallenged. And I'd like to pick up on Greg's point about attacks. I'm on Twitter. That's the only platform I have. I go on Twitter to do what I do, and I'm attacked all of the time. And the more I'm attacked, the happier I am, because I'm aware that we are creating ripples, that we are rattling cages, and you can hear the cages rattling. And you get the more intense and the more offensive and ridiculous and absurd the attacks are, the happier I am. And the more attacks there are, the happier I am, because that means that I'm actually having some impact. And I agree about the attacking this narrative head on, full on, no quarter given. And I do not give quarter. Yeah. And I just have described this from the outset as a fraud. This is not a set of accidents or mistakes that have been made. This is a coordinated campaign in order to destroy or attempt to character assassinate the left of this country through a campaign of character assassination around the issue of Jew hate, of anti-Semitism, which is, anybody who's on the left knows instinctively. You know immediately that's a fraudulent narrative. You know that the anti-Semitism, where it exists, has always been a feature and not a bug of the right and the far right. You can see it all over the world in the far right. You can see it in Ukrainian Nazi units. You can see it in the American Trump movement. You can see it in the French fascistic movement. You can see it all over the world. Anti-Semitism is built in to that narrative as part of their pitch, part of their appeal to the people they're trying to appeal to. It has never been a part of the left narrative and of discussions of the left, because it simply isn't a feature of the left. There will be some anti-Semites inevitably in any large group of people, because it's part of society. And anti-Semitism, regrettably, is still a feature of society. But to try and characterize the left by means of this completely fraudulent idea that the left is in some way sort of innately anti-Semitic. I recall Siobhan McDonough, MP, saying that to criticize capitalism was inherently anti-Semitic, because what you were really doing was attacking Jews somehow. I mean, I don't try to follow the logic there, but
that in itself, I find anti-Semitic.
Yes, it is. It is, isn't it?
What you're actually doing is saying that capitalism is a Jewish project.
That's right. That's right. That is what they said. Okay. And this went completely unremarked. I mean, she was allowed on television to say this, just as Louise Ellman was allowed on the BBC to say that she believed that Corbyn and the left, she suspected, were having anti-Semitic thoughts. And this is presented by the BBC as a news item. And I still find this rather hard to believe that actually happened, but it did. It's on YouTube, you can check it. She was allowed on The World at One, which is a news magazine program, to say as a news item that she believed the left and Corbyn were having anti-Semitic thoughts. But Simon, one of the more extraordinary episodes I've ever lived through.
Simon, what was incredible about that, as you say, is not only were they allowed on the media to say these kind of things, but they were in no way challenged.
No challenge.
Media to say such things. And I know as a fact that if you ever tried to get onto the media to challenge these things, you never got on, because it's not just who they interview, it's when they interview. So it's very much like that. Can I just ask you as well, though, 2022, and we're being told by some that this is all over and done with, you know, that the battle has been, depending on which way you see it, won or lost, but you're still in there and you're still fighting it every single day, regularly. Why are you doing that, Simon?
That's a very good question, Jackie. I have a Staffordshire Bull Terrier dog. I have a Staffy, and we've had her for 6 years, and she has taught me stubbornness. She is the most ferociously stubborn creature you're ever going to meet. If she doesn't want to do something, she won't do it. And if she does want to do it, she is going to do it. And I have learned from Lucy, my dog, that you simply don't give up. If you give Lucy a stick, she holds it in her jaw, and Staffy jaws works in a certain way that she would have to decide to open her jaws. You can't force the jaws open. And she will hold that stick forever. You can lift it up, you can swing her around, you can do anything you want. She is holding the stick. And I've just learned this from Lucy. I'm holding the stick, I'm not letting it go.
And maybe that's what people are doing. Greg, a last word. For the future, what would you say should be the main lesson we should learn from what we've experienced with the media in the last few years?
I think the left has to organise its own media now. I mean, we've lost that opportunity to take the central space because Corbyn is no longer leader. So I think there has to be a growth in alternative media. So we can do things like we're doing at the moment, but I think the unions will have to try and develop their own online paper, and there has to be crowdfunding seriously to create a counter narrative. We also need media groups all over the country to complain and criticise about the media as it is. But it's extremely hard. You know, you can write into the BBC, you complain or whatever else. It just goes into the bureaucratic labyrinth of the BBC. So there is just, and we have to work on alternative platforms. And I think that is I think the real lesson for what we've seen so far.
I think that was a very informative comment and very informative conversation with both of you. And I like to leave that and repeat it to people. What we need to do is support independent left media. That means not just watching us, but sharing what we're doing, encouraging people to watch it, and even becoming a Patreon. Please do consider. Thank you very much, both of you, and I hope we'll talk to you again.
Okay, cheers.
Cheers, Jackie. Cheers, Phil.
Okay, so now we're turning on to a very another aspect of what's happened. And in fact, again, a bit like the last item, it's not that it's just happened. In fact, as we all know, the ripples from it are still going on. The leaked report. The leaked report revealed the plotting, the racism, and the sabotage by party officials against Corbyn and his supporters, in all its viciousness, in all its dishonesty. Now, to discuss this, we have the ex-chair of the largest Momentum group in the country, and he's going to be speaking to us from Brighton. He's Greg Hadfield. And we also have the only MP and member of the Socialist Campaign Group to stand vocally and in solidarity against the witch hunt with Chris Williamson. So it was very interesting. I read today something from John Trickett and Ian Lavery being extremely specific about the blocks they had in terms of campaigning for the last election, that they weren't given the records that they needed to campaign, that resources were diverted away from marginal seats and into the seats of right-wingers with big majorities. And of course, now that, I mean, let's face it, probably most people here have seen the leaked report, we now know that this was a deliberate strategy. Chris, if I start with you, how aware were you that this kind of thing was going on?
Well, we suspected it, certainly. We weren't quite aware, I suppose, of the depth of sabotage that was going on, but it was pretty clear. In my 2017 campaign, for example, I was standing in the most marginal seat anywhere in England, and I was getting no additional support whatsoever. It was only when I spoke to Jeremy that we got a little bit of additional assistance. We were told that they were going to send out direct mailers to constituents, but none of them ever went. Well, there was no evidence. Nobody ever received one. I suspect they didn't actually send them, even though they were sending me proofs of what they were going to send. These are direct mailers that were going out and went out certainly in 2010 and indeed in 2015, for that matter, from head office, with general sort of messaging, as it were, to kind of buttress and facilitate and help the local campaign on the ground. But that didn't happen. And that was to say, that was the most marginal seat anywhere in England. And obviously, I at that time identified myself as a very strong supporter of Jeremy and the socialist agenda that he was spearheading. And obviously, they didn't want me to be elected. But I think one of the points, though, that I would make about the leaked report, whilst it was devastating in the revelations that it made, it was also written, I think, from the premise that there was a genuine problem with anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. And it was written on the premise of sort of trying to, as it were, excuse or to justify the activities of the Formby regime, that that they really were tough on anti-Semitism, and rather than actually taking it on and saying this was bullshit and should have called it out right from the start, and not seeking to appease the unappeasable, as we've just been hearing from in the previous discussion. That was the way in which that I think the party should have approached it. But just to answer your question in terms of how aware was I as to the scale of it, I don't think anybody could have really understood the depth to which they were prepared to go. I mean, the kind of abuse and blatant racism that they were indulging in. I mean, it was truly shocking to read, but I think we shouldn't run away with the idea that's the full story, because, as I say, it was very much written from the perspective that yes, we did have a problem with anti-Semitism, and anti-Semitism was absolutely used as the sort of the weapon of choice, because it was one that Jeremy conceded on. He yielded on that, and I kept saying to the Socialist Campaign Group and to Jeremy, and I know that Graham and others had said similar to him, maybe not so much to the Socialist Campaign Group, but in Socialist Campaign Group meetings, I was saying we have to draw a line in the sand. This can't go on. We've got to stand up and speak out and support our grassroots activists who have been thrown under the bus left, right and centre. But they were just running scared. They were not prepared to do that. They didn't even want to meet with the Jewish Voice for Labour. I mean, when I kept saying, well, look, JVL have asked for a meeting with us, and they kept getting all sorts of excuses, and in the end I lost my rag and said, look, what the hell is going on? These are our comrades, these are our allies. And I was then told by key figures in the Socialist Campaign Group, well, if we invite JVL, then we'll have to invite the JLN. I said, well, why will we? It's our meeting, they're the enemy. JVL are our allies. And in the end, they consented to a meeting, but only out of it wasn't a sort of an official meeting, out of the usual kind of routine meetings that we had. So we was up against it, but we you mentioned Ian Lavery and John Trickett. I mean, what did they expect? Well, frankly, what did they expect? I mean, they didn't lift a finger for anybody that was thrown under the bus. They just kept their head down, as the entirety of the Socialist Campaign Group did.
I think
so,
I think it's interesting, and I'm going to come now to Greg, that when I was looking at who the authors of that report for, because as you say, the leaked report in itself, it's deeply flawed, because its premise is in fact that anti-Semitism was a major problem within the party. I mean, of course it was a problem in the party because of the way that it was being used. Yeah. But in terms of it being a major problem, a regular thing that you saw, I certainly never saw it, and very few people I know have ever said that they saw it. But it seemed to me that the people who wrote the report were people who had been close to Momentum, close to John Landsman, and also people who had at some time been members of the AWL. So it was set up in one way. But let's face it, actually it was Jenny Formby who commissioned that report, and it was the Lotto team that commissioned that report. So Greg, in terms of Momentum in Brighton, how were local grassroots organisers dealing with that kind of issue coming down? How did you find yourself in the middle of that conflict?
If people haven't seen the report, there it is, 851 pages. And it's not to do with the framing of the argument, it's the raw material. And the raw material is definitive proof of how an internal dysfunctional bureaucracy engaged in a criminal conspiracy against its members. And various people went along with this. Obviously the PLP, obviously some people in Momentum. But when people talked about, is it a surprise? Well, you know, I've been a member of the Labour Party since 2006. I think it was 2011 when Nation Builder actually was created, when Ian McNicol became General Secretary, when the software was allowed to become the new Stasi against its own members. One of the allegations against me when I was first suspended was I described Edward Crask, a bag carrier for the Witchfinder General, Joyce Gould, as Stasi, yeah? But that's what they were doing to us. They were basically spying on us. Now, the key question is how we respond. Now, I was really touched by Alan's contribution about Jeremy, because obviously it's not about the great man of history or the nearly great man of history of only being greater. It's not about that at all. What it's about is about entrenched within the Labour Party. Entrenched, certainly over my lifetime, has been fooling people into thinking it's a vehicle for radical social transformation. Now, obviously it has advantages, but there are some difficulties. But how do we respond? Well, one of the things we don't respond by was Momentum. I joined Momentum when I was suspended because it was the only platform on which I had a vehicle to say people like me, who, as it turned out, eventually were accused of anti-Semitism, but actually they meant socialist. They meant anti the fixing that McNicol was up to from 2011 onwards. They were against people who exposed the fixing the Labour Party was when Peter Kyle got selected as the Labour Party candidate in Hove from an open selection of 16 men and no women. I mean, it's an open selection. It's against all Labour Party rules, and Ian McNicol rejected the complaint within 3 days. I submitted it on the Thursday before Good Friday, and they rejected it on the Tuesday after Easter Monday. Yeah, they must have been working really hard over that Easter. So in the end, I learned, and I knew by 2015 that the Labour Party was intrinsically, systemically a conspiracy against their own members and didn't take seriously the rules. And it goes back to Blair in politics, but it goes back to McNicol in 2011 and the technology that allows this.
So you see this as an extension of that, in fact, and something, I mean, I know for myself, you know, that certainly the penny was dropping some time ago, that the corruption was deep inside Labour regional organisations and how funds were allocated.
You know, Labour Party counts £20 million spent on 500 employees of the Labour Party, and then we see what some of them are doing. Sam Matthews, who, according to this, says he didn't know that Greg Hadfield was a member of the Labour Party. It was him who'd interviewed me, who was pursuing me, witch hunting me, for a year before he said he didn't realise I was a member. He didn't even realise an NEC member, Darren Williams, was a member of the Labour Party. So there's a conspiracy between cock-up, Sam Matthews, total cock-up, ex-Oasis employee brought in as a mate for Mike Crichton, an old-time regional officer, regional director. So it's the chumocracy. It's like we're all in it, mixed in with all those young Labour spads, wannabes, wannabe Lukey Stangers, may get a job one time, yeah? And then suddenly, Progress, Lord Sainsbury, who wanted to create the SDP by a different means and set up Progress, that got Peter Kyle and Wes Streeting through that sort of cadre and academy, and then suddenly, surprise, surprise, we get Jeremy as leader, surrounded by a PLP that's been brought up in the Academy of Social Democracy. So we're in real problems with that, because I don't think it's about what went wrong with the Corbyn project. We didn't get to the beginning. The real problem would have been is if Jeremy had actually won in 2017. We were not prepared. If we thought, I think I remember you, Jackie, saying, you know, if you weren't up for the struggle, what are you doing? Yes, basically. But when we got to 2017, if we'd have just got over the threshold into number 10, that would have been the beginning of the real problems. Those are the problems we have to solve, yeah? But one of the things that I'm really grateful to Jeremy and the 600,000 people who helped get him into the leadership is to expose the inadequacy and the systemic failure of the Labour Party to do what it set out to do.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not saying to people, don't join the Labour Party. I'm not saying our time won't come again. I suspect that, happy birthday to you, Jackie, but I'm 66. I suspect it may not be in our era, yeah?
Yeah.
But we pass on the baton. Somebody will come forward. They must learn the lessons of what the Labour Party is and has been, where it's going. And if ever we get in this position again, there are other things we can do better. And that's not just about Jeremy being a better person. I was really touched by what Alan said, actually. But mainly, I think, thinking of the technology, 2011, nation builder, so they can spy on us, you know, Facebook, Twitter, etc. The media is important. Greg Philo's work is fantastic. But somewhere out of this, we have to learn lessons so that when our time comes again, we have learnt those lessons and we recognise there are many ways of doing it. There is the parliamentary route. There is the campaigning route on the streets. There are all sorts of other issues that will come up. But we've got to tell the truth. We've got to get the Ford report out to tell the truth that these people were guilty of a criminal conspiracy against our members.
Well,
and they don't deserve to be anywhere near power.
Well, I have to say, I don't have confidence that the Ford report will in any way do that. But just to finish, Chris, just a very short comment. Why do you think that Corbyn didn't? I mean, you were his major supporter in the PLP. You were absolutely consistent. You were out on the road campaigning. You were there for him. Why do you think that Corbyn failed to actually back his supporters?
Well, I think he surrounded himself with the wrong people for a start. I mean, we had the perfect opportunity actually in 2017. That was probably the best result that we could have achieved, because Greg's right. Had we won in 2017, we wouldn't have been able to deliver the programme. It would have been a disaster, even worse than the disaster that we're faced with. I disagree with Greg, though, that, you know, that there may be a time, you know, our chance will come again. Well, it won't come again inside the Labour Party. The Labour Party's done for. We had our chance and, you know, we screwed it up. Jeremy surrounding himself with kind of, I don't know, people from the optics left, I suppose. He didn't have any street fighters, frankly, to, you know, I don't know, put some steel into his backbone. And he, you know, a tactical decision, I think, was taken to try to manage the parliamentary Labour Party. I mean, for example, Jackie, as you know, and I think this is on the record anyway, that on the day I was suspended, Ed Miliband rang Jeremy up to say that unless I was suspended by the end of the day, 30 MPs were going to walk. Jeremy said, should have said, be my guest, I'll open the door. You know, leave the bloody keys on your way out. We don't need you. Not a single one of those people would have supported Jeremy. And frankly, I don't think 30, if any of them, would have walked, because the main thing they're concerned about is their career. And they hated me because I said being an MP is not a career. It's not a job. And if you want a job or a career, do something else. Your job is to represent the Labour Party, is to, you know, deliver an agenda, a political ideology, to represent the people that put you there. When you start making decisions based on your job, You got to, then you're going to make the kind of wrong decisions, as it were. So I think that was Jeremy's key fault, really. The people that he surrounded him with, not taking, people in like Greg Philo, and then other people, approached Jeremy, and there were plenty of people out there who I think would have done a much better job. And I think that tactical error, I guess, because Jeremy is a kind of Westminster animal, isn't he? As is John McDonnell, and that's not where the fight's at. I mean, really, I think, the key thing is, and we know this, it's not just a British phenomenon, it's around the world. I mean, look in Latin America. How did the Bolivian socialist movement overturn a US-backed coup in less than 12 months? Well, they did it because they got strength in depth. They did it because they had a genuine social movement. They did it because they were able to bring the country to a standstill. They were based in the trade union movement. They were based in civil society. And they were able to use that power to force new elections. And as we know, the socialists stormed back to power with a bigger majority even than Evo Morales achieved. And that's the key. And I think going forward, what we've got to recognize is that we need to build a coalition. And we're not going to agree necessarily. We don't have to agree 100% with people to work with them. But if we are going to have a chance of building something to fight back against this, this neoliberal war machine, which, is on course potentially for World War III and, possible new, this all might be academic, because all might be eviscerated in a nuclear holocaust. The neocons that are in charge of policy in NATO, in the US, and in the EU, they've taken leave of the bloody senses. They've gone mad with this situation that we're seeing in Ukraine. And so, the challenges facing us are absolutely enormous. They are genuinely an existential challenge, and that's why I think we've got to learn the lessons of what happened. Maybe it's an easy thing, we trot this out, we've got to learn lessons. Yeah. We've got to learn those lessons. We've got to find a way of collaborating and working together, building that social movement and trying to, force some sense into these policymakers that, as I say, are driving us to a situation which, could lead to World War III and potential annihilation.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you as well, Greg. And Tina, to you.
Yes, we are now joined by David Renton, and I am genuinely pleased. Hi, Dave. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Tina.
You won't be surprised to hear that we've had some comments before you joined us on the show, but I am really glad you've joined us, because we are trying to have discussions on various issues and not just have one view, though, in this program so far. It's been, we've agreed with most of the speakers, I think. So you're the author of the book Labour's Antisemitism Crisis, What the Left Got Wrong and How to Learn from It. And I think it's fair to say you've received a good amount of criticisms from sections of the left for it, who say you didn't show enough solidarity, for example, with Jackie, Chris, Ken Livingstone, Mark, etc., Mark Wadsworth, and that you underestimated the manufactured nature of much of the so-called anti-Semitism crisis in the party. But, and I have to say, you also successfully represented Stan Keeble, who was the former Secretary of Labour against the witch hunt after he was sacked from his job for alleged anti-Semitism when he was filmed having a conversation outside the Enough is Enough demonstration against Jeremy Corbyn. And I think that makes you a very interesting discussion partner for tonight. And we do want to discuss with you the question, what role did anti-Semitism play in the defeat of Jeremy Corbyn? So, and first I'd like to ask you your assessment about how many real cases of anti-Semitism you think there were in the Labour Party. And, sort of as a percentage, if you can, how many false, empty or malicious accusations there were. Just before I let you speak, though, because I think you say in your book, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you write something like there must have been tens of thousands of anti-Semites in the Labour Party, whereas the figures we've seen, we all know from the Jenny Formby looking at anti-Semitism cases, it comes to something like 0.08%, 450 cases, of which most of them received a written warning. So in your assessment, how many of these cases were actually proper, in the real word of the definition, anti-Semitic cases?
Okay, well, first of all, I wanted, because you asked me specifically about that quote from my book, where I say there must have been tens of thousands of people in the Labour Party who held certain things, which I say were anti-Semitic. Where that comes from in my book is from a particular survey I'm quoting, which is from way back in 2014. It's not from the period where Corbyn was leader of the party. It's from the Miliband period, but it's not even a survey of Labour Party members. It's a survey of people in Britain in general. And the survey was conducted by YouTube. It's published. It's by let me get that right. Not YouTube, obviously. By YouGov, and it was published in early 2015. And they asked people if they agreed with various statements. They asked people, do you believe that Jews are superior, think that they're superior to other people? One in 6 people in Britain said, yes, I think Jews think that. People were asked if they thought Jews were dishonest in Britain, dishonest in business. 1 in 9 people said that Jews were dishonest in business. These are just ordinary British people, not political activists. They were asked, okay, if one of your relatives married someone who was Jewish, would you be happy or unhappy? And 1 in 10 people said they would be unhappy. So when I say there must have been tens of thousands of people in the Labour Party who held those views, all I'm saying is if 5 or 6 or 7 million people think that they wouldn't want members of their family to marry Jewish people, then you apply that over to the Labour Party. Even if Labour is better than Britain as a whole, in a party of 600,000 members, that must imply that some of those attitudes are swirling around in Labour too. I wasn't suggesting that you can draw a line from people holding those attitudes in 2014 to things which were said in 2018. But I was saying there is a problem of anti-Semitism in Britain. It's latent, it's pervasive, and it's real. In terms of what proportion of complaints were true and false, I mean, I think it's incredibly hard I wouldn't try and put a figure on it. What I would say is, I suppose to say 3 things. Firstly, undoubtedly, there were some false complaints. One of the examples I give on my book is of a person who's making complaints about individuals in the Labour Party and who's making those complaints at the rate of 3 a day, 7 days a week for 2 years. And they come up with 2,000 or 3,000 complaints. When you look at, you can trace the complaints made by that individual, and they're complaints like, for example, someone signed a letter to The Guardian saying that Corbyn had a good record on anti-Semitism. And they said, that's anti-Semitic. Now, that's obviously a false complaint. Yeah, so there are false complaints. But there are also true complaints. And I'll just give a couple of examples which I cite from my book. I cite, for example, a long-standing anti-racist activist who turned around and spoke to a Jewish Labour MP and said, quote unquote, I fucking hate Jewish people. I quote a Labour candidate for council office who said, quote unquote, the Holocaust of 6 million Jews is a hoax. And you know, when people did those things, whatever definition of anti-Semitism you use, it seems to me pretty clearly that crossed the line. Now, what I'm really talking about in the book, though, isn't exactly that, because I think there were a relatively small number of people in that category. What I'm also talking about is something else, which isn't exactly anti-Semitic behaviour, but it's behaviour which is baiting people online, thinking you're counter-attacking, calling Jewish people traitors, saying that Jewish people were taking money from Israel, people sharing quotes that had their origins in David Icke websites. I think there was a lot of that. And it's that which I'm really writing against in my book, that thing that's prior to anti-Semitism, that feeling that it's all right to row with, to fight with, to bait Jewish people, and to think that somehow in doing that, you're carrying forward the arguments for that. I think that there was a profound mistake that people did that. And I think it gave energy and confidence to the people who wanted to attack Corbyn.
You write in your book that, there's a quote, the campaign, and it's interesting you call it a campaign, could not have lasted had it not been for the reality that the press and Labour supporters were repeatedly able to find instances of behaviour which was either anti-Semitic or within the touching distance of it. And you say the press, the Labour right and the Tories could not have successfully made a story out of the anti-Semitism critics had it not been for the experience of Jews and others who found prejudice in parts of Labour's base. There's no smoke without fire, really, which is what you've just also described. There is, of course, another perspective which I would advance, which is that since the bombing of Gaza, in particular in 2014, Israel has come under increasing international pressure over its barbaric treatment of the Palestinians. The boycott, divestment and sanction movement has become very, very popular, putting Israel's actions and the fate of the Palestinians at the forefront of many people's political campaigning activity and their social media output. And then we got in 2016 the shock election of Corbyn being elected leader, an out-and-out supporter of the Palestinians. Moshe Machova has described this as a happy converging of interests. So you have the right wing inside and outside the Labour Party who really want to get rid of Corbyn. You've got the corporate media who like a hoo-ha, who like a bit of a fight. And you've got those who work for the Israeli government and the embassy who found themselves all with kind of the same target, Jeremy Corbyn. Happy convergence of interests. And don't you think that much of the right jumped onto the anti-Semitism bandwagon for mostly those cynical reasons, to get rid of Corbyn and the left, rather than any real concerns about anti-Semitism?
Well, if you were asking me to analyse the motives of the right, now I'm going to start off by thinking about the right as the major institutions by which the right wins an audience, things like the newspapers, the Times, Telegraph. Do I think the Times and Telegraph are motivated by deep love of Jewish people and deep desire that Jewish people in Britain, say, should get to live without racism? Obviously not. They're in a functional alliance with the people in America who are like Donald Trump, who oversaw this kind of shift in global right-wing politics, which, in my book I try to argue is where anti-Semitism came from initially. It's that kind of shift from a moment of economic history which has lasted from the late 70s to about 5 years ago, where all the major politicians wanted there to be an open, globalizing economy, to this new kind of nationalist way of running capitalism, which is a kind of way of running capitalism which looks repeatedly for enemies who are cosmopolitans, globalists, and which Jews fit very neatly into that mindset. So I say that's where the anti-Semitism came from. And obviously there's something bogus about the Times and the Telegraph, or the Mail or whoever, posing as friends of the Jews. But I think it's really stupid as a left to say, oh, it's terrible, the Times and Telegraph, or people like them, or people take a lead from them. They're hypocrites and they're being mean and they're attacking us when they should be nice and honest about us. All my experience in politics, and I'm in my late 40s, I've been around quite a long time. I don't remember those people ever treating the left fairly. Our job isn't to say you're hypocrites. Our job is to try and think, why are people believing them? Why are people listening to them? Why are people taking them seriously? And we need to get to that middle ground of people and give them a better explanation of what's happening. It's very striking to me, for example, that while in Britain we had a Jewish community, a mainstream Jewish community, which largely accepted what was going on, the conventional explanation of the Corbyn crisis, at exactly the same time in the States, you had a Jewish community which was moving to the left, which was becoming much more critical of Israel, much more anti-Zionist. And you need to think, why is it that when Jewish opinion, the largest group of Jews outside Israel, is actually moving towards being much more critical of Israel, why in Britain did it go so differently for us? And the only way I can explain that is that when the large majority of Jewish people watched the crisis, saw how we behaved as the left, they didn't like what they saw of us. They saw things like the Mir 1 mural. They could see for themselves how left-wingers were behaving on social media. They saw us counterattacking, and rather than us, when we tried to counterattack, rather than us persuading people, rather than us winning people to our side of the argument, we actually turned critics into our determined opponents.
But don't you think that often, as chair of Labour Against the Witch Hunt, I've seen dozens of suspension, investigation letters, expulsion letters, etc., and very often, I have seen a couple of examples where I thought, actually, you should apologize. This is actually anti-Semitic what you're writing. But that's maybe 2 out of 50 letters that I've personally seen where I thought this is actually anti-Semitic. The rest was mainly criticism of Israel. Didn't even mention Jewish people. It was very often criticism of Israel. We showed a clip the other week of John Landsman, who you praise in your book quite a lot. You think he did quite well on anti-Semitism. And he described as anti-Semitic the sentence, somebody saying, "I hate Israel." That is anti-Semitic. I think that is actually a redefinition of what anti-Semitism is, which we've seen in the last 5-6 years, moving away from "I hate Jews," which clearly is anti-Semitic, to "I hate Israel because Israel is doing this and that and this to the Palestinians." I mean, do you think that's anti-Semitism? I hate Israel?
Well, look, the examples I opened with two. One was someone saying "I fucking hate Jews," and one was someone sharing on their Facebook something saying the Holocaust didn't happen. Now, when we're talking about that sort of behaviour, I don't think you can turn around and say that's legitimised because the people thought they were doing this in support of the Palestinians or had a social justice approach towards Palestinian-Israeli issues. Those people that I'm talking about there are doing things which on anyone's definition are anti-Semitic.
I agree. What about I hate Israel?
Sorry?
What about I hate Israel? I have no argument with you on I hate.
Look. Yeah. I mean, look, I'm not quoting John Landsman because of that quote. When the things that I get out of John Landsman are very specific, and it's not that quote. The things I get out of John Landsman were that just at the moment when Corbyn was elected, he did something which I think was politically sophisticated and sharp. So we're talking about winter 2015 to 2016, long before the crisis at its absolute peak. He goes on, he gets himself interviewed by the Jewish Chronicle. He does this absolutely brilliant thing. He does an interview saying, I'm part of Jeremy Corbyn's inner circle. I am an anti-Zionist Jew. I became an anti-Zionist Jew by the experience of going to Israel and being horrified by what I saw. And he got the Jewish Chronicle to write this up and to do an extremely favourable piece about him and about the left. And in the whole long story of what happened over the next 5 years, it was about the only time that I remember the JC being at all sympathetic to the left or to the left's causes.
I think now,
there's certain things he got right by doing it. He did it early. He did it before the crisis was at its peak. And that's the reason why I use him in the book, because at least he saw that it was possible to approach Jewish opinion, it's possible to talk to Jewish organisations and to approach them as potential allies, rather than as people to be shouted with, argued with, portrayed as the enemy.
But I would argue he'd done it from a politically wrong point of view. He didn't understand that the attacks on Corbyn were often in the name of fighting anti-Semitism. Like with his quote, I hate Israel is anti-Semitism. That's the whole idea of equating and conflating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. And I think that's a real problem that's happened in the last 6 years that I don't think quite your book really gets. Or maybe you don't really the idea that people who've been fighting against racism all their lives, in Israel, the racism of the Israeli state against the Palestinians, are being called anti-Semites because they criticize the state. And I've seen the evidence. Calling as Israel a racist endeavor makes you now an anti-Semite, according to the IRA's definition of anti-Semitism.
Yes, but I spent quite a lot of time, along with other people, trying to point out the faults of the IHRA definition and to argue in support of the people who've tried to undermine it, who've tried to get universities, for example, to withdraw from it. Again, I mean, if you're talking about the allegations against members of the Labour Party, which have led to their suspension, one of your points earlier, they've all been about Israel. My honest feeling is that's wrong. There's a kind of pattern that goes on right now, as far as I'm concerned. And I should say, by the way, that I have done quite a lot of unpaid voluntary work through organisations like Momentum, helping people who've been the victims of suspensions, writing letters to them. That's how initially I got involved in Stan Keeble's case, long before it got to the courts, where I was able to play a role there. Just literally in his workplace, I was drafting letters for him to send back to the employer to try and stop him from being sacked. Now, it seems to me, if you look at what's happened right now, almost all of them, they're just factional. Almost all of them they're not even trying to pretend they're about anti-Semitism anymore. It's just literally, you've disagreed with the Labour Party, and so now we've got an excuse. But that wasn't the pattern in 2017. That wasn't the pattern in 2018. And in terms of the mistakes which the left made, the worst mistakes I think were made earliest on, when it was possible to change the story. Just generally on Israel-Palestine, you know, I do spend 6 or 7 pages of my book trying to explain to an audience in a way which the Labour Party never did during the crisis why Palestine is a cause of justice. I go through the house demolitions, I go through the nighttime raids, I go through the differential citizenship laws, I go through the law of return, try to explain this to people. It's something that Labour never did during the crisis. But I do absolutely hold that a movement that's serious about building Palestinian rights has to look at its own political borders and not allow that defence of the Palestinians to feel like it's being argued in racist terms. And that is something we've got to keep at.
I think the problem that happened is that there was no doubt confusion. There's confusion in the society about what is anti-Semitism, and you know, is the Jews do this and that. It does happen. I've seen plenty of it in wider and on Facebook. You see this kind of nonsense. What hasn't happened is, I think, any real education, and I don't mean education like, you know, like Keir Starmer wants. The pro-Zionist Jewish labor movement gets to decide what is anti-Semitism, what isn't. We know they don't understand it. They don't want to understand it. But a proper discussion, nothing like that has happened. What's happened is you said one wrong thing, which might or might have not been anti-Semitic, most likely not. Many of the cases I've seen are not anti-Semitic, and you're out. And I think this campaign, which as you say, you know, it's now been turned into its opposite, but it started there. They licked blood, didn't they? They licked blood. They could see, oh yeah, somebody is saying something critical of Israel. We say that's anti-Semitic, and we say the whole labor movement is anti-Semitic. This is now reflecting it today. We're feeling the results of this today. Free speech has been silenced, proscriptions of groups. I know you're not in support of any of this, imposing IRA and etc. BDS movement supposed to be illegal, etc. Low-key gets banned from Spotify because he's an anti-Semite, etc., because he's speaking out in solidarity with the Palestinians. I believe this campaign that we're witnessing now and which is spreading now is down to not really understanding the weaponized nature of that campaign, where even the smallest hint of being critical of Israel has been turned into, this is anti-Semitism, and people have been attacked, and now we're still reaping the results of it. And I wonder, do you not see that this is now that this is like it's an ongoing campaign that started with false accusations, many false accusations of anti-Semitism being allowed to fester and being allowed to be presented at anti-Semitism. As you weren't very strong on that John Lanzmann quote. I hate Israel. That is not anti-Semitic. I mean, can we agree on that?
Well, one of the reasons why I don't want to just say I agree is I do think some of this is about context. Yeah, I was giving advice to an organisation which works around Prevent, and they said, and I did a talk for them, and it all went down quite well, and seemed to be getting on very well. So yeah, it's terrible how anti-Semitism is being used against people. They weren't particularly worried about the Labour Party. They said, we keep on getting these calls, and it's being used against everyone, and people making perfect political. For example, only just now we had this phone call from someone from Eastern Europe, and she said that her son was being accused of being an anti-Semite in his school, and it was absolutely terrible. All he'd done is he quoted from a biography of Hitler. So I said, well, sorry, I just want to hear a bit more before going, that's not anti-Semitic. So we went back and we checked, and it turned out the biography he quoted from was from Mein Kampf. Now, I'm not using that example. I hope I'm not using that example unfairly. I think you do have to have a bit of context here.
Feel a bit like
someone's saying, I do not like the Israeli state.
No, I hate it. I hate Israel.
It's changing the words I hate to I don't like. I'm not looking at and saying that in itself is bad. The problem is it's just you do want to hear a bit more. What else has that person said? could it be an indication? I don't want to turn around and say I'm giving that person a complete free pass no matter what else they've done. If that's all,
have you seen many of the suspension letters, expulsion letters?
Yeah, I have actually.
You get one line, one tweet. Sometimes only a sentence from a tweet. It could be something like "I hate Israel."
And to be honest, some of them are even worse than that. They're things like, "You went along to this political meeting. Didn't you know that at this political meeting someone would be speaking and that person is being suspended?" The whole dynamic in which it's gone is absolutely horrendous. But the problem is, your question is doing two different things. You're asking me to agree to give that person a clean bill of health, and I'm not without, maybe because I'm embarrassed, I just won't without knowing more. Where I'm willing to agree with you to much greater extent, though, is about free speech in general. Last year, this isn't the only book I brought out. I also brought out a book just on free speech and saying the left needs to be much tougher in arguing in support of free speech. We've got, something that's going on right now. We've got a bill that's trying to impose higher free speech on universities. I've written for a dozen different newspapers, including some right-wing ones, in a desperate attempt to get people to talk about it, because the government's doing a massive attack on free speech. And in the left, we've got such a weak tradition of actually speaking up for that. I don't accept the campaign against anti-Semitism was only or mainly false. I'm sorry, I just don't. I think that it used to be part of the left's armoury that we were the people who fought anti-Jewish racism. If we can't get that understanding back, then we'll make the same mistakes as we did under Corbyn. But just each time we make them, there'll be fewer people listening.
I'd have to disagree with you strongly on that one. The campaign against anti-Semitism is quite clearly, it was a very anti-left campaign, but campaign small c, small. Oh, right. Oh, I see. Okay, gotcha. I thought you meant the actual campaign.
No, I don't mean CAA. No.
Okay. Well, okay, that was sort of interesting. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
We do want to have a little bit controversy in our show, and I think that certainly counted as one. Thank you, Dave.
We are still learning about this, and I think next time when we're faced with a subject like this, we need to put it into two programs. But we've got one last Vox Pops that we want to show you, and just a little bit more information, so just hang on for a moment.
If things had turned out differently and he'd won the 2017 election, how do you think things would be now?
Splendid, 100 times better.
We would have a more just, a more compassionate, just a better society where people cared for each other and about each other.
In a word, how do you feel looking back? What's your feeling?
Bitter. I think that the lasting bitterness is towards the Labour Party. I know for a fact that I will never vote for them again, ever.
The numbers of people who signed up for Jeremy Corbyn showed that he had a big pull among young people. And when they got rid of him, a lot of young people thought, well, where are we going to go? Looking back on the whole thing, how do you feel?
Pretty heartbroken, really, because the fabric of our society has been torn apart, and there are going to be a lot of people go through an awful lot of suffering as poverty increases.
And I'm sure we've all felt like that at times, but we have to remember this stuff is cyclical. We will come back together. And this is partly what this program is about. It's about learning the lessons of the future, about bringing the left together. Please don't forget to contribute to Patreon so we can end up with a fabulous studio where we can do everything from. And I have to tell you that the next program we are attempting to do is going to be about the issue of trans. Now, everybody should look horrified at that, because we know what conflict that has caused. And it just shows you the courage of the editorial board that we're attempting to do it. Now, when this was suggested, somebody who was asked to come on the program said, why would we do that? You know, you wouldn't have a climate denier on. So we're not prepared to speak to people who disagree with you. We wouldn't have a racist on. You wouldn't have a racist on for the same reason. And actually, what I thought was 40 years ago, when I was one of the first people actually campaigning, when I was a professional campaigner on global warming, and nobody knew anything about it. Nobody knew anything about it. If I had said, I'm only going to talk to people who are going to agree with me, then we would have never have moved anybody. This whole issue of trans has come on the table for some very specific medical and social reasons. And for many people, this is recent. And we need people to come forward and say, we want to talk to you about this. We are offering an open and supportive platform to have that discussion here in 2 weeks' time. So if you think that you know of anybody or would like yourself to actually be considered for being on the programme, then please let us know. And thank you very much. All right, good night all.
Good night. Simon.